Thank you all for coming out tonight. I appreciate the invitation to speak at Emory and to give this talk tonight. It's a topic that's close to my heart, that I have sort of a love-hate relationship with. So hopefully you'll enjoy the journey with me this evening. Before I sort of dive in, though, do you mind just sort of shouting out what disciplinary field do you align with? That might help me tailor some things.
Rhetoric, English.
When you say English, do you mean literature?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not my current job.
Spanish and Portuguese.
Oh. All right. Okay. Cool. Great. I don't know really what I'm going to do with Spanish and Portuguese. Oh no, wait. I do have something about global Englishes, so we'll get to you. Okay. Great. I tend to present rather informally, so if there's anything that I say along the way that you're like, oh, I don't understand that term, or I don't know what you mean, please don't hesitate to just interrupt me, raise your hand, or just shout out, and I can stop and explain. I identify as many things, disciplinarily speaking. Because the name of my field has changed a lot over the years, and I'll talk about that in a second. But to make things simple, I'm just going to call myself a computers and writing scholar, computers and writing. And as a computers and writing scholar, my initial approach to the digital humanities was with suspicion. When the term DH rose to prominence in the late 2000s, particularly when the NEH created the Office of Digital Humanities and its eponymous startup grants, many of us in the field of computers and writing, and those of us I hope to show tonight, who've been doing digital research for decades by then, well, we were skeptical at best, annoyed and frustrated at worst, and in an attempt to make the most of DH, attempting to call ourselves digital humanists with the hopes that funding might follow for the kinds of digital research and teaching projects we'd been working on since 1975, and probably earlier. So this is a story that you will hear repeated often in computers and writing circles whenever anyone mentions the term DH, or digital humanities. For CNW scholars, DH is a mask. Don't be offended, just bear with me. For CNW scholars, DH is a mask behind which literary studies pulls itself out of its supposed crisis. Whereas feeling like the ultimate hipster know-it-alls, CNW has found itself in the late 90s and 2000s, and even still now, supposedly thriving. Don't worry, this is not a lecture about the superiority of writing studies. I know better. And I know that that's not a welcome conversation, and indeed is wrong. Instead, I want to take up the spirit of what Douglas Walls recently called, in this new book, The Rhetoric and Digital Humanities, he calls it a rhetoric of alliance. And he says, a rhetoric of alliance positions DH and rhetoric as distinct entities that need to align with each other to create language that makes one potential path of exchange, one based on mutual respect rather than privileging. In particular, tonight I want to focus on what is not yet a mutual path of exchange, but is an asymptote: pedagogy. As it seems to be one of the places where the rhetoric of alliance between computers and writing scholars and DH scholars can happen most readily. And so if you don't know what an asymptote is, since none of y'all shouted out math, it's this imaginary line that shoots up when a curve, and it looks like they're about to meet, and they get closer and closer and closer, but they never actually, maybe, theoretically, meet. So Douglas Walls, in his chapter, relates the story of building a digital humanities curriculum at University of Central Florida, where he's asked whether his class, which is called Writing in Digital Environments, is a theory class or a tools class. And for a rhetorician, this question makes no sense. Rhetoric is about theorized use of and reflection on the tools of communication, of writing, and, as with pedagogy, of teaching. Which has meant that for almost a century, or for as long as there has been scholarship in writing studies as a discipline, there has been scholarship that is focused on writing and the teaching of writing. This won't be news to many of you, I suspect. But tonight I'm particularly interested in exploring how close the fields of computers and writing and digital humanities, as is explored in English departments in particular through literary studies, can get. So how close can these two fields get when we talk about digital pedagogy as a form of researched praxis? For instance, with the burgeoning of research on making and makers, maker labs, things like that, which has come out of DH pretty recently, and other gendered instances of DH pedagogy, I invite you to hear a little more tonight about how writing studies has always been about making. We call it composition. Now, to the Prezi. Oh, so I forgot to tell you a little story to start. I like stories. The title of this talk came from an MLA presentation that I did in Vancouver, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, whenever that was, when I was asked to present about the role of writing studies at the Modern Language Association. So if you're familiar with the way that the MLA has recently restructured the divisions and the forums and all that stuff, they've added a new writing studies category, which is a big deal, because for the first time in over 100 years, writing studies has been represented. And that feels pretty nice. And so I was asked to give this talk about the relationship between computers and writing work and DH work. And I realized that, one, they had scheduled our session at 8:30 on Friday morning in a tiny room, so no one was going to come. And two, the only people who would come would be other writing studies people. So there was no need for me to go over the history of DH and CW because all of the Rhet Comp people already knew that history. And three, there were at least 7 other panels at MLA doing the exact same thing that I was supposed to do. So I got up there, and instead of telling about the history of CNW and DH, which I will do for you tonight in full, lucky y'all, instead I got up and I read a poem. Because a large part of my background in this field, oh, I went backwards, is oh, I just want to go to the beginning. Okay, so a large part of my background is actually in poetry. I have an MFA in poetry, and then from there I did a PhD in rhetoric and technical communication. And so I dug deep back into my poetic roots to write this poem about asymptotes. And I named it, I gave the presentation this title, The Asymptotic Relationship, because I remembered along the way, I was reminiscing about when I was 20, and I used to hang out at this place called the Cabaret Voltaire that was a coffee bar in downtown Norfolk, and they had poetry slams every Friday night. And this guy, Ron Brooks, got up one night, and he was an MFA student at Old Dominion at the time, and he read this poem called Love is an Asymptote. And when I was 20, I thought that was the best poetry title I'd ever heard in my life, right? I was like, oh yeah. And I don't really remember the poem, but it went with the title. And I said to myself that day, I was like, someday I'm going to steal that title from Ron Brooks, and I'm going to use it in some poem that I write, right? And well, I stopped writing poetry a long time ago, except apparently I didn't, because I got up 3 weeks ago and read one in front of Rosemary Fayal and Mariana Hirsch, and that was an interesting experiment. But funny enough, Ron also left poetry and became a WPA, writing program administrator, and we reconnected through the years, but I was not his lovely asymptote. It was this other girl, Lydia. Okay, so, which was totally okay with me. No, I don't want that either. How do I go back to the beginning? All right, let's just do this. Oh, look, there we go. Okay. All right, so these are the different areas of DH that intersect with digital humanities at the center, or new media studies at the center if you want to take that route. My background, electronic literature, because my MFA was actually, I did digital poetry. So I'm informing this conversation from that area and how media studies and literary studies often work together to integrate into DH work, the history of that, and also as rhetoric and composition as a discipline within English studies has funnels down into smaller in-disciplines. And one of those in-disciplines is computers and writing. But there's some glossary. I'll go back to that later. All right. I'm going to zoom in because I know you can't read it back there. I found that having this glossary is pretty helpful for folks who aren't familiar with the intricacies of my insider discipline. So I thought that I would just throw this up there to give you an idea of what it is that I'm talking about when. Okay? So computers and composition is the name of a subdiscipline within rhetoric and composition. It's the subdiscipline that studies teaching with technology and technological tools. Rhetoric is also a part of it, and techno-rhetoric is part of it. Computers and composition, big C, that's the name of the print journal. Computers and writing, big C, is the conference that we all go to. Computers and writing, little lowercase letters, is another name for the field computers and composition. Did I say that twice? Okay. You know what I mean, right? Okay. And then we get to, more recently, digital writing or digital writing studies, depending on what somebody feels like at a particular moment in time. And then also we bring in digital rhetoric. There's about 7 other names that I could have put up here that are included in the idea of people who research writing and the teaching of writing using digital technology. Okay? So tonight I'll probably just mostly talk about computers and writing, lowercase. All right. But I got to step back a minute to that big pie, to the rhetoric and composition, and how we got from teaching first-year writing at Harvard in the late 1880s, or the early 1880s, like it matters now, right, to today. And so you might have heard of current traditionalism. Now, if any of y'all are, die-hard ret comp people, you're going to know a lot of this history that I'm going to tell you. But I'm going to asymptotically try to make connections between the theories and the research that happens in rhetoric and composition as a research-based discipline that focuses also on pedagogy as the research of teaching, with computers and writing as the subdiscipline with digital humanities, okay, as it's been practiced. Contemporary writing studies theory doesn't do this anymore. We would like for this to just go away, but it won't, because it's part of the history of our field, okay? So this is when people say, Johnny, you can't write, that's coming out of this level of modern argument. When rhetoric and composition was still a new disciplinary field, still really trying to become a field and figuring out what it was doing. So there was a lot of prescriptive work going on there, which is what a lot of people assume that writing studies and still does, because that's what first-year comp is supposed to do. Well, actually, no. Okay. So I won't be able to answer for you tonight what first-year comp is supposed to do. Well, I could tell you what first-year comp is supposed to do, but you may not want to hear that answer. So we might not go there. But building out of, when the discipline of rhetoric and composition starts to become a discipline, and it first started having PhD programs that were in Ret Comp in the 80s, and like 1980 is the first that I can find. There might be some earlier, but I couldn't find any. We start working off of these milestones. Can y'all read those in the back? The big milestones? And try and bump it up a little bit. There we go. That's a little bit better. Okay. So we have from the 50s all the way to the present, we have this process, writing as a process, that takes us through the research in writing studies. And again, I apologize if this is old hat to some of you. But I think it's really important to point out because a lot of the current work happening in pedagogy in the name of digital pedagogy has no idea about this history. So I've stood on my soapbox and I've shouted in many occasions in my life, but pay attention to what we're doing. And in the end, you know, Doug Walls has this beautiful line in his article, which is built on Native American rhetorics and the idea of listening and giving and I will give and you can take it up or not, right? And so that's this rhetoric of alliance that I have to start practicing and that I've been trying to practice the last couple of years in saying, this is our history. So it's here if you want it, and there's some good stuff here. And please allow me to introduce you to it. So, probably everyone in this room, perhaps, has heard of the concept of writing as a process. And writing as a process simply means that we don't have one shot to get it right. Current research in writing studies will tell you that every single writing situation on Earth, at any moment, is different from another one. Every single time we sit down and write, we are writing something different. So having a one-off doing it, research tells us that that's not a very good method for teaching people how to write, certainly. And that undergirds all of the research that follows, for the most part. I am focusing mostly on the pedagogical research here in rhetoric and composition, although there are plenty of streams of research that do not have what we call the compositional turn, that are focused more strongly on rhetoric and writing research that is about workplace writing and community-based writing that comes out of technical communication, or about writing as, rhetoric as speech acts, which come out of typically different departments than English departments, speech comm departments, for instance. Okay, so writing studies starts talking about peer review in the 60s. And I find this fascinating to go back and look at the research. Are all of y'all familiar with CompPile? It's a great name, right? C-O-M-P-P-I-L-E, CompPile. It's a pile of composition research. And it's an online database that it's an index of every piece of writing that's ever been written in rhetoric and composition studies. It's got like hundreds of thousands of entries. Like, I don't remember. I looked it up last week and I've totally forgotten. But it's literally hundreds of, literally hundreds of thousands of entries. And you can go in it and look up peer review. And you'll get, 30,000 articles that people have written on peer review. And yet, as a digital publishing scholar now, right, somebody who's putting that rhetorical and compositional and academic literacies practice to use through professionalization and publication methods, I find it really interesting that all of a sudden peer review and open peer review and collaborative peer review is like this new hip thing in digital humanities areas. And I'm like, no. Oh, that's not a rhetoric of alliance, I'm sorry. Look, we have a large body of research on peer review and collaborative writing and student-centered teaching, right? So you look at these terms as they move up the timeline, and it might resonate with the language and the terms and the concepts that digital pedagogues are using more currently, like today, like in the last 5 years, as these terms have, as the idea of digital humanities pedagogy has really burgeoned. So I won't detail all of these, but I'm happy to detail any of them if you would like me to go into particulars. And then Spanish, okay. So See where it says global Englishes and then down to academic literacies? So there's a whole sideline to this that's related to writing across the disciplines and writing in the disciplines, I got that wrong, and writing across the curriculum that leads us to writing center theory work that starts in the 70s, right? Late 60s, early 70s. And then that is parallel with English for academic purposes and English for special purposes, which comes out of schools of linguistics. And so like John Sayles' work, right? Where you're teaching students specifically, how do you write academic genres? And a lot of that work is happening at the graduate level. Like, how do you teach students to write a thesis, like, or a dissertation? Or how do you teach students from China, whose English is their second or third or fourth language, how to write in English for academic purposes, right? And so that work is happening in Europe, completely separate from the work in the US, because of the US's deep tie in writing studies to pedagogy in a way that doesn't happen in countries outside of the US, okay? So there's this alternate reality timeline that involves academic literacies and global Englishes and the connection between those. Okay, does that work for y'all? Okay, so so at this point, I want to point to digital technologies as the middle 80s, right? So personal computers happened when? 1983? Yeah, something like that. And mainframe computing in writing classrooms happened when? The mid-70s. Yeah, right? So there's the curve here, digital humanities and humanities computing, is again an alternate timeline that coincides with this work. So in the 50s, you're getting some mainframe work in humanities computing just starts coming. I can't remember exactly what the sort of father, what's his name? There's like a key figure in DH who's considered the first digital humanities computing guy, and his name is, he's a father.
He's Italian.
Yeah, he's Italian. It's not Ong. It's not Walter Ong. Oh my God, I'm gonna have to look it up now. Crap. Okay, so like he comes around in like 1954, I think. You're gonna look that up for me, right, David? Okay. Somebody's on that. See, this is why I can't count myself as a DH person, because like I can't remember the key points in their history, whereas the history in my field, like it's up here, right? Everybody in my field knows it. So anyways, humanities computing starts happening here, where humanists are starting to work with corpuses and
Busa?
Yes, Father Busa, thank you. Starting to work with corpuses and keying texts in and using IBM cards and all that sort of stuff is happening through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so as that work is happening really rather independently, it's sort of humanists striking out on their own to work with computing specialists. The same happens in writing studies over here, where humanists are striking out. And in fact, in 1975, let's go to where the asymptote comes together. Ellen Nold publishes the first article on computers and writing. And it's in the journal, or the big journal in composition studies, College Composition and Communication. And if I remember correctly, the name of that article is something like, A Humanist Tentatively Approaches the Computer. And it's like, yeah, hell yeah, it's 1975. We're a little scared of that stuff. But so we're talking about networked mainframe computing at this point and bringing it into writing studies, the same time that it's happening independently, right, in areas of research in literary studies, okay, through humanities computing, and then which turns into digital humanities later on, okay? So in this middle part is that intersection between rhetoric and composition work happening over here, and digital humanities work happening over here. But it doesn't ever really come together until much later. But so let me go over a couple of these key points with you. So I point out Ellen Nold because there's a major award in computers and writing that is in honor of her. It's the Best Article Award, right? And named after her because hers was the first article in the field. Hugh Burns, we have the Dissertation Award named after him because he wrote his dissertation about, he wrote a software program, okay, where it taught students to use like Burkean logics or something like that to learn how to write. And he finished that at UT Austin in 1979. Okay? So it's considered the first dissertation in computers and writing. So already people doing sort of large-scale mainframe work and bringing it into the classroom. Then the first computers and writing conference, big C, big W, right, held in Minneapolis in 1982. So can you imagine, like, this would be like the first that camp, but in the early 80s. So that's kind of, in some ways, what I compare it to. So when people get really excited about that camps, I have to be like, a rhetoric of alliance. But no, I think that camps are a great thing. I do. I'm skeptical, but I appreciate them for other people. So the first Computers and Writing Conference is in 82. In 83, the first issue of Computers and Composition comes out. This is the premier print journal in this discipline that studies digital pedagogy, the teaching of writing with digital technologies. The very first issue of CNC is mimeographed. It's essentially a newsletter. Within a year, and it's got articles that are like 3 paragraphs long, sure, and it's about how do I use word processing in my writing class? You know, things you need to know when it's 1983. Yeah, and it comes out of the CNW conference. Within a year or two, it's picked up by Ablex and is published as a scholarly peer-reviewed journal. And it's hot, and all of a sudden, it's 4 issues a year, full peer review, full-length articles as they get longer and longer through the years. And now it's like almost impossible to get into that journal. Okay. A year later, the software samplers start at the National Council of Teachers of English and at 4Cs. If you're not familiar with 4Cs, it's the Conference on College Composition and Communication, so the major umbrella conference for writing studies, people at the higher ed level. I like to point out the software samplers because actually, not so much like the Computers and Writing Conference, the software samplers are a tradition that have been maintained over the last 21 years. Every year at 4Cs, we still have the software samplers. We don't call them that anymore. Now it's called the Computer Connection. And Douglas Iman, who's my co-editor at Kairos, has been running those things for like the last 1,500 years. And they are more like in the spirit of that camps. And if you're not familiar with that camps, they stand for the Humanities and Technology camp, that camps. The software samplers are the same idea. You get a bunch of people together and you talk about, how are you using Prezi in your classroom? How are you using video editing in your classroom? And they're meant to be a sampling of these praxis-based uses of tools, critical understandings of tools, but always rooted in the practical of how will this help our students make things? How will this help our students better communicate in the world, right? And then there's the main conference, which has the intensely theoretical versions of that run parallel. So that starts in '84. Right? The first grant-funded computer labs for writing labs happened in 1985. Cindy Self and Richard Self at Michigan Tech get a huge donation from Apple to start the CCLI, the Center for Computer Assisted Language Instruction. And the whole history of that lab I won't even go into because it's a lengthy history. And it's fascinating. And that's where we get the study of spatial arrangements and architecture in writing labs. It's born out of that lab and other labs that were built like that around the US, saying, okay, we have this theory, these groups of theories that come out of writing center work, really, that say, okay, some of the best writing happens with students, with burgeoning authors, when we sit side by side with them and sort of mentor them through the writing process. What happens when we insert a computer into that equation? And so you get a lot of models of computer classrooms. For instance, one of the universities that I've worked at, Illinois State, also started their computer labs for their writing classrooms in 1985 or 86. And they had 8 computer classrooms in 1986 just for the writing program. Just for the writing program. And every single, to this day, every single 101 class and 145, which is like their business writing, meets in those computer classrooms. And when they were first designed, it was all a perimeter arrangement, right? Cubbies built, you're going to love this, cubbies built around handmade, because they had to be handmade because there was no furniture that they could get to fit the rooms, because the rooms were actually too small. With 22 computers, so the cap of the class was 22, and each cubby had, you know, whatever the computer was at the time, an IBM, whatever. And then there was a top part on which sat a dot matrix printer for every single computer in those 8 classrooms. And at the end of every hour, when everybody hit Control P, right? Can you imagine? But like the model was, the teacher didn't need an instructor station, because the teacher would be going around using a writing center pedagogy to teach the students, you know, and to, you know, not a panopticon, but a leaning in. Oh God, I just used that phrase. It's been ruined. Okay. So that was one model for architectural spaces. And there's bodies of research built around how and why, and what theories go into building networked writing spaces, right? The CCLI was built on a different model at Michigan Tech. It was built on pods. They had a little bit more room so they could spread out. You know, pods are the circles, right? And so there's 4 or 5 computers that face each other. Great for collaboration, great for group work, great for totally decentering, teacher-centered learning, right? And again, there was no instructor station. There was at least a computer for the teacher if she or he needed one, but it was also about, okay, let's move around the room. Let's use the space more organically, more collaboratively, more interactively. And that lab is, both of those spaces have been remodeled, but the CCLI in particular still maintains that innovative pod-based thing, which is now we're thinking, oh yeah, that's normal. It's normal for labs to be designed that way. But in 1985, it was not, right? You have to fight with the computer science people and the IT people who still want to put things in rows. And you're like, you cannot teach writing in rows. You heard me say it. Okay. Getting on to our list. All right. Oh, I skipped a bunch of stuff. Is it important? Oh yeah, so, oh yeah, this is very important. So have y'all heard of the Digital Humanities Summer Institutes? Well, in a rhetoric of alliance, let me share with you, now I'm just making fun of it, I feel bad because it's a really good theory. Let me share with you that in 1986, Cindy Self at Michigan Tech, this was really she is the woman who started the field of computers and composition, and she edited the journal for 30 years, or 25 years. So she was a forerunner on a lot of the pedagogical research happening in writing studies. And she started Computers and Writing Intensive Classrooms, which was a 2-week summer institute. And like everyone in my field knows it, and everybody signs up for it, and it's going to be 30 years old this year, and it still sells out every summer. She brings 30 people in from around the world to teach them, how do you teach with technology? And these days, as it's migrated to more and more media, how do you compose media with your students and also yourselves as researchers, right? And how does that influence the writing process? Because over here in the 90s, you get the rise of multimodality as a method for both items to research, text to research, and for teaching in the classroom. Okay, and along the whole way, writing studies people are building software. right? Like Hugh building this writing program early on in the 70s to work with his students, and the Daedalus group making this interactive networked chat program, essentially. And people were using Moos and MUDs and all sorts of things that we don't really use anymore. But it was there. The Writing Studio, a home-built content management system that now has over like 7 million user hits. 96, 3 online journals start, 2 of which are still running, one of which is the one I edit. And then in the 2000s, I'm going to zoom back out a little bit so you can get a sense here. Right? So between humanities, computing, digital humanities, and now, more recently, the rise of DH pedagogy, we get a lot of independent research. Digitization work becomes a huge thing in the 90s. Hypertextual archives also become a huge thing in the 90s, and that still continue today. Now there's tends to be a more social media aspect to it. And so these things are running alongside all of these things. And the only difference now is that I made fun of that camps earlier because I was telling David earlier that I had to stop going to them because when I would go to a that camp, someone would come into the room and say, I just discovered that we can teach our students how to make videos. This was like 3 years ago. Okay. And I'm like, yeah? Like, how do I tell you politely that I've been doing that for 15 years with my students? Right? Never mind the long tradition in media studies and in comm studies where students are making films, right? Not digital media, digital videos. So there are these connections. Right? As the asymptote and the curve get closer and closer, there is this relationship that is there, that is present, that is perhaps not taken advantage of from either side of these lines as they could be. There is a lot more about research and tool building and tools that computers and writing people can learn from DH people. And there is a lot that computers and writing people can offer to DH people about pedagogical methods and research and practice. So, as we, look off into the future, do you like my visual rhetoric there? You know, they say that the asymptote and the curve never meet. But in some realms of theoretical math, they do. And I'd like to think that they do. And so I think I'll end there. And I'm not going to read you my poem because I want to save you from the crossover. But instead, I hope that what I've been able to show you tonight is a bit of a coming together in a bit of a way that there are an abundance of resources that all of these fields working together have. And I didn't even talk about the role of electronic literature in all of this, which is, again, another timeline that so tightly integrates in with all of this. But I hope that you will have questions about this, that you will have challenges, that you will have ideas and opportunities for us to engage in during the Q&A. So thank you.
Computers in composition and computers in writing mean the same thing, but do you consider writing in that situation to include what? To include visuals, to include sound?
Yes, and that's why in some ways we've moved to digital rhetoric as a term because it more broadly encompasses the kind of textual production that's happening, right? And so when I say textual production, I don't mean linguistic content only. I don't mean alphanumeric content only. I mean, it's an assumption in the field of digital rhetoric that all texts are multimodal, that it is impossible for a text to not be multimodal, because even if it is just a written, 8.5 by 11, academic seminar paper, it has visual components, it has spatial components because of the way that it's laid out, because of the margins, because of the paper that it's on, etc. So yeah, writing is, when we talk about writing in our field, we mean any kind of compositional work. Including, some people bring in, music and talk about, that kind of composition in the writing classroom.
Where does discourse analysis fit in? Or does it? Or is it like on another graph somewhere?
Well, discourse analysis is a method, so I don't...
It's a method, but also as a theory and as a practice.
Doesn't that raise the question, what is discourse? I'm having an ongoing discussion with my dissertation director about that. Discourse, does it necessarily mean linear flow of words? Or can it mean that?
So Jody Murray argues in his book, The Non-Discursive Rhetorics, that discourse begins with images. And there is cognitive theory to prove that. So that's perhaps how I would answer that part of the question. But as for discourse analysis, I still don't really know how to answer that.
Well, I think that the main theorist that I know is James Paul G.
Uh-huh.
He boils it down to thinking any kind of corpus, right? So we could study the discourse of computers and composition, but computers and composition can also help us study the discourse of other things. And I think he breaks it down into a set of questions about significance, relationships, breaking or making, and some other things that are kind of connected to all of those, politics, social goods, things like this. And I think that is becoming a larger part of some composition things that I've seen of both teaching, a lot of us I think are teaching discourse analysis without saying that that's what we're doing, but also as a place where lots of different scholars are ending up with roots in English or roots in composition or roots in rhetoric.
Right.
And they're moving in from rhetorical analysis or literary analysis or community analysis and kind of landing in discourse analysis. And so I just wanted to see if you...
Yeah, what I was going to say was, that prompted me to think, well, that's what I would call rhetorical analysis. Or genre, and genre analysis is sort of a different thing, but that it's all getting at these ideas. You can do a technology analysis, you can do a media analysis. So what are all the different analytical frames that you can put together? I don't know that I would lump all of those under the umbrella of discourse analysis, just because I don't know. If you want to, I guess. Don't say that I gave you permission to do that. Yeah.
So a follow-up to my question is to tell you that I come from film studies, and from film studies I went into video game studies, and from video game studies I'm now interested in software studies and code studies, and media studies. So I'm wondering, in your visual rhetoric and as you laid it out, I've come at it from this different route from what you're describing here.
Right.
But what is the relationship between the computers and writing trajectory and then the new media studies, software studies? Is that where computers and composition has gone?
Yeah.
Okay, so can you say a little bit more about that? Because I'm familiar with, the software studies, Levmanovich, and he's coming out of a film tradition, and there's sort of a media production tradition out of the creation of images or video games that's also influencing that. So I want to know more about that
Right.
part of it.
Yeah. So the circle that I started with, which had media studies, literary studies, electronic literature, and I have a different version of that pie chart somewhere else that that has even more fields thrown in: film studies, art and design, computer science, etc. And at the center of all of them, for me, I used this when I was on the job market 100,000 years ago to explain what new media studies was for me the first time I went on the market. I should use that in the portfolio thing this morning. With new media being at the center of all of these fields with all of their wedges of the pies, right? So, and each field gets to that center a different way. So I've traced a little bit about how rhetoric as the crust, of the writing studies part of the pie moves from, rhetoric and composition. This is kind of crusty, isn't it? So rhetoric and composition sort of writ large, to computers and composition as the middle part of that pie, to new media studies as my entry. But I've also talked about how computers and other places I've talked about how computers and composition as a field has, at this point, we're up to about 7 generations, starting back in 1983. We've gone through 7 different generations of scholars and theories that are associated with those scholars. So we move from the first, this relates, okay, so the first generation of scholars are those who do not have PhDs in rhetoric and composition. They were literary studies scholars who became writing studies scholars by default for whatever reason, right? And so they're doing some of the foundational, the groundwork. And then there's a second generation who did have PhDs in Ret Comp or some field like that, who were building on that, and many of them were adding an overt feminist composition perspective and critical literacies perspective to the work of teaching with technology and writing research with technology. And then there's a third generation that does, it's been a long time since I've thought about this. There's a third layer that does visual rhetoric. And now we're getting really tiny, right? And there's a fourth layer that does, and in some ways it coincides with this. There's a fourth layer that happens around 2000 with not just visual rhetoric, but all of the modes of communication. So we get multimodality. And alongside that, all of a sudden we see a parallel within computers and composition studies where people are doing game studies, right? When like James G's book came out. And then we get Lev Manovich's Language of New Media. And so then we get new media studies on top of multimodality. And so we've got game studies, which the boys were doing at the time, right? And new media studies, which the girls were doing at the time. And thankfully, that's a little bit come together, but not quite. Then we get code studies and software studies that are coming out of game studies. And multimodality kind of doesn't go there always. It's doing some other stuff. And we also get cultural rhetorics that come in like the 6th generation, et cetera. I don't know, we're in the 7th generation now, I think, but I don't really know what to call it.
Do you think, Cheryl, that generation is the right metaphor? I mean, it sounds a little wishful, like, that you could talk about people being grandparents and whatever, but it seems a little coterminous. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you're talking about over 11 years.
No, it's longer than that. It's, I mean, it's
2003, 7 generations.
No, since 1983.
1980.
Yeah, since the founding of the field.
31 years.
Yeah, and
that's awfully fast.
It is. It's Moore's law. That's exactly what it is, because like for the first 10 or 15 years, it's one generation, and the second generation lasts about 10 years. The third generation lasts 4 years. The fourth generation lasts 3 years. Like I can time this according to key texts in the field. I really need to write this up one day. And I can also time it in relation to key moves in PhD programs in this field, and when key people graduate from those PhD programs. So like I can trace code studies back to Carl Stolle and his graduation at Purdue in 2004, right? I can trace multimodality back to me and Danielle DeVos graduating from Michigan Tech in 2002 and 2004. 3 or 4. Yeah.
I'm interested in what you said about that first generation, the phrase by default, some of the reason. Is there any like data on who and why?
Oh.
Maybe without getting anecdotal, like how did these people decide they were going to do this? I'm sure there's too many stories.
Oh, I know. I mean, it's just like there must be actual research on that. But I mean, because I lived it by seeing my mentors do it. Does anybody know? I'm thinking of maybe like Lisa Gerard's work or something, but there's got to be. I'm gonna have to go look it up now. I knew somebody was gonna ask me some question I wasn't gonna be able to answer.
Dappled discipline would be a great place to start.
What's it called?
Dappled discipline.
Dappled discipline.
And Phoebe, and then the dappled discipline, it's the kind of where she talks about how the field of English kind of starting to split and herself.
Who wrote that?
Lauer, Janice.
Janice. Oh, right. Yes. Yeah. That would be the one. If anybody's going to write about that history, it's going to be Janice Lauer. Yeah.
I have one more question for you.
Yeah.
It's just the asymptote, because I don't know the math, so forgive me. Do you think this is literally asymptotic, or is this metaphorical?
Oh, it's, oh.
Because the part of the curve you're focusing on doesn't strike me as enough to establish that it's asymptotic.
Oh. Why not?
I don't know. I literally don't know how to define an asymptote.
Oh, I can define it for you.
I know, but it's at a portion. You've got a portion, but maybe the line is something else. And if you look.
Well, okay. So I'm going to quote for you this definition, which, lucky for you, is the opening line of my poem. This definition comes from Wikipedia. I ended up writing a poem for the MLA presentation because I was like stymied. I was like, I don't need to go and read this history to writing studies people. And so I went to the Wikipedia page of asymptote to see how it was defined to make sure I wasn't totally goofing up something. And it was the most poetically written Wikipedia entry that I have ever read in my life. And this was the opening line. To get my poetry stance on. No. In analytic geometry, an asymptote of a curve is a line such that the distance between the curve and the line approaches 0 as they tend to infinity. I mean, isn't that beautiful? And it just goes on from there. So I just like shoved a bunch of stuff in between all these beautiful lines from Wikipedia. But yeah, so I mean, it's like, as the curve and the line approaches 0, right, as they tend to infinity. But then there's this other definition as it gets farther along that said the word asymptote is derived from the Greek something or other, which means not falling together, which also is beautiful, right? And so there's this idea for me that DH through pedagogy and C&W may never quite fall together, but metaphorically, as I wrote in my poem, I like the idea, what if not falling together doesn't mean not coming together, but not tripping, not stumbling, not failing together? So for me, it's both. It is both literal and metaphorical. Does that suffice? Yes?
I have kind of a follow-up question to some extent. I'm wondering, so I can see one of the possible problems in using this figure is it assumes that they're both going to continue to move in that direction, that they are not going to kind of curve off suddenly on a 90-degree angle. But I'm more interested at the moment in terms of what you see as possibly being in the way of them kind of coming together. I got the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, from some of the allusions that you were making in the talk, that the now much maligned kind of rhetoric of innovation is perhaps part of the problem, like constantly saying everything's new and ignoring if it has perhaps been done before.
Yeah.
And I think, there's also a very gendered component to that, I think, between DH and computers and writing. But I'm just wondering what you see as potential stumbling blocks between the two fields falling together in a way.
I think you've just named them.
The two main.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that those are. There is the added problem that C&W people don't feel welcomed for many reasons that have merit and don't have merit. And that's a personal challenge for the field, for people in the field. So, like as MLA has, and one of the reasons why I attend the Modern Language Association now, when most rhetoricians stay as far away from it as possible, is because of its DH component. That there's some really interesting stuff going on there, and I can learn, right? I'm gonna learn by going to a session on periodical studies where they're doing, data visualizations of 19th century newspapers. And that's cool. And like somebody in rhetoric actually might do a similar study, but nobody might be right now. But I'm also not necessarily going to be able to pay attention to that at the Computers and Writing Conference because I have other things that I have to pay attention to when I attend to that conference, right? But then convincing other rhetoricians to attend MLA where this really cool DH stuff is being presented is a, it's a mind block for some people. They're like, people are so mean, it's job market, blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't know what y'all did last week, but I was in Vancouver, right? Learning cool stuff. So yeah, there's also, my friend Kristen Arela and I joke a lot about the whiteness and the maleness of DH, except it's really no joke. Like I tease Gentry Sayers constantly about, maker labs, which I know is dangerous with like maybe here, but also, Georgia Tech, I cannot say that. Because it's like a bunch of white boys and their 3D printers, which is true. So, there was that great article in, what was it, The Atlantic last week or the week before that this woman wrote about the problems with maker culture and the gendered nature of it. It's a really, really well-written piece. I recommend anybody go hunt it down. Yeah, that it's got to be new. It's got to be, and we're doing it the first. And that's been my problem with that camps as well, that there's like a lack of insight into the fact that maybe somebody's done this before. But again, like I used to get really angry about it because I was younger, right? And so I could afford to get really angry about it. But now, like, I edit the premier digital journal in my field and I have to represent in a different way. So I try really hard to suppress my really stubborn nature and say, okay, tell me what you're doing because it's really cool. And together, let's like form a digital pedagogy collaborative, which we're actually doing because I called somebody out on Twitter about it 8 months ago. And now all of a sudden I'm going to a meeting about it, right? So like, that's cool. When we can come together in that way, there's enough people doing the pedagogical component of it, at least to sort of set aside their differences, to set aside the we were there first sort of thing, that we can get in the same room and say, okay, what can we learn about peer review in publishing that builds on this? And what can we learn about that in relation to the disciplinary boundaries in these different disciplines that want to do this kind of work, et cetera? Thank you. Thanks for asking that. Yeah, James?
Kind of off-the-wall question.
My favorite.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the asymptotic thing for a while, and then this presentation turned out to kind of be a history that's kind of in parallel, or is at least not quite meeting, so two histories, but then as you're explaining some of the more recent history, there's like 4 or 5 histories branching off one another. And I'm wondering if you're to try to compose this history, it sounds like a linear model of a linear historiography wouldn't work. So, like, what medium, what mode, what form would you choose to compose it? And what would that bring out about, I guess, what you think about this history?
Right. So I learned about this method from the design students that I've been working with in Oslo. There's this newer area of the design field called service design. And one of the methods that they like to employ is gigamapping, which is exactly what it sounds like. And so they get like entire walls full, because of course they're design students, so they have like sheets of paper that they just pull out of their back pocket, and then beautifully design these network maps, essentially. I mean, and that's another way of doing it. I think of the writing studies tree, right, and how complicated that project is in order to map. I mean, talk about generations again. How do you map who your mentors are and who your siblings are, the people who went through your program with you? And how do you do that in relation to institutions, right? And so that's one disciplinary model that's already so complicated. And in order to do it fully, when we're talking about 3 or 4 or 5 disciplines together, then, gigamapping has got to be involved. Yeah. Yeah.
As long as we're doing off-the-wall questions.
Sweet.
So I and a lot of my students, when I'm looking for something academic, one of the first places I often go is Google Scholar. And I'll have a set of terms, and it'll bring up matches for those terms regardless of discipline or journal. So very often we'll find ourselves citing something, because it's a great concept without, is this cultural studies? Is this linguistic discourse analysis? Is this Redcom discourse analysis?
Right.
And because more and more of us are, I wound up writing half a dissertation chapter about like French sociology just because like there were some words that happened to overlap with my dissertation. But so I think because more and more of us are getting the information this way, I mean,
Yeah.
on one hand you do have this danger of really wiping out history and wiping out context, which is a real danger. On the other hand, I wonder if there isn't something kind of exciting about that, about a way of kind of getting over these turf wars. So just
yeah. There's I mean, you don't don't mention ethnography around an anthropologist sort of thing, right? But yet people are doing ethnographic work all the time. And yeah, there is a danger of not knowing the history, but hopefully that's what your supervisor is there to like go, whoa, wait a minute, let's go read these 7 books first. But yeah, that's the way a lot of people do research now. If you're familiar with the Media Commons project, it's a publishing platform in media studies that there's a bunch of people running it, but I primarily think of Kathleen Fitzpatrick and Avi Santo as being the primaries on that. And I know that Avi's been trying to work towards a DH startup grant where it's called Digisaurus. I think, the last time I read about it. And I don't know if they've gotten funding yet, but they really should get funding for this because I search for this term in my field. And so like, if somebody in DH searches for digital pedagogy, they're not gonna find anything in computers and writing because that's not the phrase we use because our entire field is digital pedagogy, right? So we have all of these other key terms. So the Digisaurus will like map it on to different disciplines. And I'm like, how this thing sorry NEH, but how this thing did not get funded the first time it went around, like I have no idea. So they resubmitted it and I'm like, we need this.
have a lot of fun with that too.
Right. You had a question?
Yeah, actually it's kind of 2 very different questions, but I was at MLA in Vancouver too, and I think we were in the same room together with a panel on DH genealogy, and it was really kind of not great in general.
I would love to talk to you more about that.
Yeah. And I was wondering, like, this impulse, because there were quite a few panels at MLA too that wanted to talk about history or genealogy of DH, right? Like, there are all of these histories popping up and trying to give some sort of linear Right?
Right.
It's all very linear.
Right.
Explanations of the forefathers, and they are really forefathers, which came up in the question and answer period
Yeah.
of DH. And why you think that impulse is there right now in 2014, 2015, where it's still very, DH itself is a very recent thing, computers and
Right.
writing, obviously,
Right.
a separate thing, but also on kind of a separate note, you have DH pedagogy, and I know you talked a little bit about why practice and pedagogy is so important, but why DH pedagogy specifically and not DH?
Yeah.
Right? Like
Okay.
in terms of the research component, and
Right.
where that, like this asymptote may never come together because of that research pulling
Mm-hmm.
pedagogy
Right.
away from
Right.
that.
Okay. The first question was easy to answer, and now I have to remember what it was.
History.
Oh, histories. Yeah, that's an easy answer because every field, as it's trying to become a field, has to outline its history, right? Has to concretize that. I mean, rhetoric and comp has been doing it, did it for like a good 20, 30 years from the 60s, 70s, 80s. There's all these historic books about its history, its lineage. So it's not surprising at all to me that DH is trying to do that now. It's complicated that it's happening in certain ways because, like, personally, I don't think DH is a field, right? It's a collection of methodologies, but other people.
Who are doing it, they're saying the same thing, right?
Yeah.
They're saying this isn't a field.
Yeah, and
It's really interesting.
you got a lot of it at MLA this year in particular because, and in that panel, which was an attempt to do it, because unfortunately I helped put that panel together, and it didn't turn out like I was hoping, because the hope was, let's bring together all of the disparate ways that DH is done across all of these different fields and really talk about it in some depth. And then it turns out that like 7 other people had the same idea, right? So that's why you got this scattering of it throughout the conference. But the second part of the question was much more complicated.
Why DH pedagogy instead of
Oh.
DH?
Right. The easy answer to that is because that's where I see the asymptote and the curve coming together, right? Because the more complicated answer is the research that people in literary studies who are taking up the DH mantle, if we're going to talk about English departments, right? And how DH is represented at MLA, for instance. The research that gets conducted there and the research that C&W people do often don't look anything alike. Occasionally there's crossover. When you get somebody who's a rhetorician who's doing archival research, right? Then their work might look like somebody who's doing corpus-based, digitization or text mining work in literary studies. But there was a more complicated answer to that. I don't remember what it was. Dang, because it was really good. It was really complicated questions.
I guess a way to rephrase that question might be, do DH pedagogy and computers and writing, or computers and composition, or whatever you want to call it, do they start to come together because they're both minority discourses that are not, like
Yes.
DH itself
Yes.
is the important work, and DH pedagogy is that other
Absolutely.
craft that people do, and so they
Yeah.
can
Absolutely. Yeah, so the story that I was going to tell to answer the second half in a more complicated way is, WVU, where I work, was just awarded a $1 million Mellon grant to build a new academic publishing platform. And I'm the PI on that grant. And I have to say it that way because that's the way Mellon wants me to say it. And I'm happy for them that they gave me $1 million. And in order to get this project done, I am asking the graduate students in my editing class to do a bunch of research with me about editorial and publishing practices. So research that they need to do in order to learn about editing and what it means to be an editor, and the theory that gets built from editing work, and to deliver that work to the developers who are going to be building this platform. And I was really excited about this project and integrating my research into my teaching. And so I was talking with someone recently, and they said, "Oh, what's your teaching superpower?" And I'm like, bringing my research into my teaching. Like I am the bomb at that, and have been. And like that's one thing that I'm really proud of. And then I met with my. This is going to go on YouTube, right? Sweet. I mean, this is like it's me, so whatever. And then my first year, I'm new at WVU, and so I had my first year review, and I met with the chair, and he said, "Oh, just everything's great, and your grant is great, and you're doing great," and he was very supportive, and he said, "But if one thing that you might want to keep in mind is when you're explaining work, you're teaching to people, be careful that it doesn't sound like you're using your students to do your research." And y'all are nodding like, "Oh yeah, of course." And like, I'm like, oh! Like it would never occur to me to do that, right? Like these students are learning crap tons about editing and publishing by doing this research, right? Plus they get to be co-authors on a bunch of stuff. So there's all these benefits that they get out of this work because it's everyday practice for somebody in my field to bring that kind of research into their classroom. I mean, in another form and fashion, we call it service learning, right? And that's just one of the assumptions of my field, that you do that kind of work. And in literary studies, that is not the case at all, right? So there's this total disconnect between the research that happens in DH traditionally and the research that happens in CNW, and how the classroom is the space that happens in between. Yeah.
Just a little technicality, isn't the difference between the two, whether you're using a student or whether the student is really making, progress in their career, co-authorship? I mean, that's big.
Yeah. I mean, but it's not just co-authorship, right? Like
They're actually learning.
They're actually learning. Right? Like I have this whole thing called an editorial pedagogy, and my whole pedagogy is built on professionalizing students who are becoming professionals. So I'm going to teach them how to be a professional in a particular field, and we're going to work on the genres that those professionals work on so that they can basically treat the class as an internship. And then we're going to read theory that goes along with that so that they understand why they're doing that all along the way, right? So apparently, though, I need to explain that better to people.
You can just show this.
But I mean, this is. I wasn't actually surprised at all that he said that he offered that suggestion, because it's a typical critique for somebody in writing studies to get that kind of feedback. Unfortunately, yeah.
I'm having a hard time figuring out how to be in a rhetoric alliance with some people. Some people, like the MLA types, which is the field that I originally come out of, but I feel less and less close to that. So I'm studying traditional literary studies. And especially I'm a Breton Fellow at Georgia Tech, so that sort of pushes in a certain way.
Right.
But I feel more and more distant from people in that sort of traditional thing. And when I go to, say, co-faculty events that I've gone to at other schools, and the minute they find out I'm a writing teacher, "Oh, my students are terrible at grammar, tell me what to do."
Yeah.
Get out of here. But I start, well, it's not good writing isn't about grammar,
Yeah.
I feel like I have a hard time having those conversations.
Yeah. I've stopped telling people that I'm a writing teacher.
Yeah, well, maybe that's it.
Yeah, I say I'm an English professor, but I research digital publishing practices. And so I don't even...
Why but, not and?
Because what do they assume when I tell them I'm an English professor?
Jane Eyre.
Yeah. I usually use Moby Dick. I like to pick on Moby Dick, sorry. Although I recently discovered the total wrong thing about that is like there's a student, there's a lot of international students who are in this architecture and design program in Oslo. And it turns out some countries never read Moby Dick, never even heard of it. And I was like, whoa, where's that global Englishes thing? Yeah, that doesn't answer your question though.
Yeah, I think I'm like searching for ways to build or develop something that I can use in these sort of collegial situations. But also,
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting question in and of itself.
Yeah.
In a time where some of us are getting forced to rub up against other disciplines in ways that might be comfortable and might be great, but in ways that sometimes aren't, how do we develop that? Is there a way that can develop that? Maybe this is a whole other talk.
No, I mean, there's an entire body of research that talks about that, and it comes out of writing in the disciplines, a lot of it, and WAC, writing across the curriculum, as well as I think now one of the ways that a lot of people are talking about or trying to engage their colleagues in these conversations are through the writing about writing discussions. Writing about writing is this place that we are in the theoretical tradition of writing studies, where we are reclaiming our own scholarly history to remind ourselves as scholars, but also to remind our colleagues, writing studies has a research tradition, and we have content in that research tradition. And so we can't think of writing like a first-year comp class as a service class, as a skills and drills class anymore. That's current traditionalism, right? And we are still trying to give up that model because it's been proven to not work over and over and over again, and there's scholarship about that, right? So if we take the model and you know, Elizabeth Wardle and Doug Downs are the two pioneers about the writing about writing theories, and it's based on rhetorical genre studies, where you're taking this idea that you shouldn't be teaching what Wardle calls these mutt genres in your class, right? And mutt genres are like the academic paper. Like, what the hell is that? Where does that exist in the world outside of this classroom, right? So instead of teaching made-up genres in any of our disciplines, whenever we assign a writing assignment, we should assign actual, real genres that exist in the world, that have real audiences, that have real stakes, that have real evaluation criteria, implicit or not, embedded into them, and then figure out with our students, what are those criteria? How do we make those implicit criteria explicit? Oh yeah, I'm gonna talk about this all day tomorrow, I forgot. That's a little preview for tomorrow. Yeah, just tell Rebecca you're not coming, and then you can come to my talk tomorrow. Otherwise, I just run the other way. If somebody talks about writing and like, oh, my students can't teach, I'm like, oh, I gotta go. Because it's, especially if it's somebody I don't know.
Yeah.
Because nobody goes up to, you know, a philosopher, right, and says, you know, post-structuralism, I just hate it. It doesn't happen.
Am I not supposed to be saying that to people?
From now on, you are. Yeah.
I have a question. Maybe this will be a nice place to end. We'll see. For those of us who are, I guess, Generation 8, or hope to be, and are moving through the dissertation process, do you have thoughts or advice on how we can draw these lines closer together? Or, I mean, we're being told now there's no point having a PhD in rhetoric and composition if you can't code.
Who's telling you that?
We can talk about who after if you want, but it's a name people will know, so I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, okay, good idea.
And that seems counterproductive to me rather than forward-looking.
Well, I mean, so that's not in the space, right? That's somebody who wants you to be in the space, but then, I don't know, that's complicated. That's complicated. I mean, I don't know. I'm gonna have to think on that.
Isn't being in space, I mean, isn't something that you're talking about, isn't something you're advocating of an approach, almost, I kind of hate to say it, but almost a humanistic approach toward being in that space, right? Being in the middle space. And
Yeah.
whoever said that to you is not in that space. It's coming from you know, kind of the traditionalism side, and is like trying to hit you over the net like with a tennis racket. But you know, like I wonder if that's part of the discussion. Like once we get to, if you want this, you have to do this. If you're going to do this, you can't do it without that. Like, is
Right.
that part of what you're trying to undermine?
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, I think so. But I also want to back off a little bit on my gasping a second ago. Because, I mean, I don't know who this person is. I don't know what their motivation is. But you might say the same thing of a kindergartner. How do you graduate kindergarten now unless you know how to code? I mean, that's radical. But it's happening in places, right? I mean, no, nobody's not getting graduated from kindergarten because they don't know how to code. But like, you know, code schools are popping up all over the place. These kinds of functional, critical, technological literacies have become commonplace in our world. Does this mean that you need to be a master coder in order to get a PhD in Ret Comp? No. Your work may not actually deal with digital tools and technologies. If it does, you damn well better know how to code. Sorry. But like, if you're working in that area, then yeah, you need to know how to do it. I mean, the other side of this story is my work with Kairos and being an editor, and the things that authors send me indicate where we are in the field at a given moment, right? There are these cultural artifacts that actually I can trace. I've told Cindy and Self and Scott DeWitt this many times, and I used to help with the summer institutes that they run, and they're called DMAC now, Digital Media and Composition. Every time Cindy and Scott changed the curriculum for the DMAC institutes at OSU to teach a different technology, 8 months later, Kairos gets that technology submitted, right? And I see it happen, and I'm like, yeah, that's cool, but when we teach people how to use Prezi, let's say, Kairos doesn't publish Prezis. Kairos publishes HTML pages that have Prezi embedded within them. Kairos doesn't publish YouTube videos. It publishes HTML pages that stream YouTube videos from within them. Why? Because of archival and preservation purposes, for indexing purposes. We have to have that HTML stuff. We have to be able to download the Prezi, to download the YouTube, to download whatever it is, that third-party media, and host it on our server. And that's because tomorrow it could be gone. And what kind of scholarly journal would we be if we didn't even attempt to hold on to this stuff? And so I get authors who send me stuff, but they don't know how to code a simple HTML page. And I know that that's not easy. And that's part of why we had this ridiculous mentoring process for our authors. Or at that point, I'd just say, okay, go cut this code from this other page and figure it out, you know, trial and error. And I think we forget as scholars that the farther we get in our careers, the less time we have to learn, which is why places like DMAC and Digital Humanities Summer Institutes and Winter Institutes and the Dartmouth Seminar for Research in Rhetoric and Composition are so important. Or, you know, the NEH Summer Institutes, you know, for literature scholars, like all of those, we have to be able to keep time for ourselves to continue learning and continue plasticizing our brains and keeping them flexible throughout our entire careers. Or we're just going to become that scholar that we hate. So maybe that's all to say that instead of me gasping and saying no, right, which has been pretty much my reaction to DH for a very long time, that instead I should like say, okay, I'm going to take 2 weeks and breathe with you, you know, and I'll give and you take, and then you give and I'll take, and we'll see what happens in between. Okay, thank you.